Big Four consulting firms are commonly used by organizations in their digital transformation initiatives, but there's pros and cons to using a Big Four consulting firm. What exactly are the pros and cons? That's what I'll talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And early in my career, I started off as a Big Four consulting firm. It was actually called a Big Five consulting firm back then, but it was an important part of my formative years as a consultant. And even today, as independent technology agnostic advisors in the space, we commonly work with the Big Four consulting firms. And in my experience, both working at a Big Four consulting firm and working with Big Four consulting firms here in more recent years, I've learned that there's a lot of pros and cons to working with these firms. Now, what I'm going to do today is talk about what the pros and cons are and to determine whether or not Big Four consulting firms are right for you, not only from the perspective of you as a potential buyer, if you're potentially engaging a consulting firm, what are the pros and cons that you need to be aware of, but also if you're a consultant by career, by trade, is a Big Four consulting firm right for you in your career? So I'm going to talk about both as we go along here in terms of the pros and cons of Big Four consulting firms. Now, if you're learning from more lessons that I've experienced from having worked at Big Four consulting firms, along with other general digital transformation strategies that might help you in your initiative, I encourage you to read my new book called The Final Countdown. You can buy that on Amazon. You can learn more about it by scanning the QR code in front of you, going to a link below, or you can go to thefinalcountdown.com to learn more about that book. Let's start with the advantages of Big Four consulting firms. One of the most important advantages is that Big Four consulting firms have very broad skill sets. They have a lot of different practice areas, a lot of different competencies that they've built throughout their time in business. In addition to having broad skills, Big Four consulting firms also have a lot of resources. Generally speaking, these larger firms have hundreds of thousands of consultants at their disposal throughout the world, which means there's a lot of options, a lot of scale that comes along with those organizations. The other factor to consider is that Big Four consulting firms generally have pretty good training programs. They have well-defined processes and methodologies, and they're pretty good at training people on how to deliver those services. So whether you're ready to potentially engage with a Big Four consulting firm, or if you're looking to begin a career at a Big Four consulting firm, these are a few of the advantages you want to keep in mind. Now, despite these advantages I've talked about, there's also some disadvantages to Big Four consulting firms that are important to recognize and be aware of. First of all, Big Four consulting firms are oftentimes notorious for hiring young, inexperienced people and then trying to train them on the job to learn and become good consultants. It's how I started my career, and I value that experience and that training that I got while working at the Big Four consulting firms. However, sometimes I wonder if that was the right thing for the clients that I worked for. I was billing while I was learning, and I was not only billing, but I was billing a pretty high rate for someone that was just out of grad school at the time. So that's something to be aware of, is a lot of times you get a lot of younger, inexperienced hires that don't necessarily have the street credibility and the battle wounds if you're going through a complex digital transformation or business transformation. Another thing to keep in mind is that Big Four consulting firms are very, very focused on revenue. And even though every consulting organization, any technology provider, any business for that matter, is focused on revenue, and they should be, it's more the fact that Big Four consulting firms are so big that in order to make a project worth their time, they have to generate a pretty significant amount of revenue for themselves as a business. This may not be a huge problem if you're a large multinational Fortune 500 organization, but if you're a mid-sized company, or especially if you're a smaller organization, it may be that the sheer cost and volume of leveraging Big Four consulting firms is too much for your organization. And add to the fact that oftentimes Big Four consulting firms are very good at ensuring they maximize revenue and get as many billable resources on a project as possible. I know I saw it when I was at the Big Four consulting firms. They were very good at getting me staffed and billable really quickly, even before I had any credible experience and credible value to bring to a client. Similarly, a lot of Big Four consulting firms will focus on political gamesmanship. There's a lot of politics in these big consulting firms, not only because they're a Big Four consulting firm, but just any big organization oftentimes will have politics. But I did find in my experience, both within the organization and working with Big Four consulting firms even now, that they're highly political. They're very focused on preserving their self-interest, protecting their turf, owning the project, and making sure that other consulting firms and other third-party providers don't have an opportunity to entrench on what they consider their project or their footprint within an organization. So it turns into a very political situation when you have Big Four firms, especially if you're overly dependent on the Big Four firms and there's too many of the resources on the project. And then finally, Big Four firms are notorious for being relatively inflexible. Because they have such good training, good methodologies, they're so big and they're good at mitigating their own risk, and they tend to hire younger, inexperienced people, they have to be somewhat inflexible. They have to have a cookie-cutter approach to digital transformations and all the steps along the way in any sort of technological initiative. And while there is some value to that, you do want repeatable methodologies and tools and whatnot, you also want to make sure you have some flexibility. And the flexibility comes with experience and comes with having more seasoned resources, which oftentimes the Big Four consulting firms don't have enough of. So you want to make sure that if you're working with a Big Four consulting firm, you recognize that they're probably going to be a lot less flexible than you'd like, and you might have to push them and manage them in a way that ensures you're getting the flexibility you need out of their services. So the question now becomes, do we engage with a Big Four consulting firm? And if so, how do we engage with them? First of all, it's important to recognize your options. It's not an all or nothing either or proposition. You could leverage a Big Four consulting firm, but you don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. They'll want you to, and they will put an immense amount of pressure on you to put all your eggs in one basket. But if you're hiring a Big Four consulting firm, you can hire some resources from a Big Four firm, and then you can hire some resources from another firm. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to be careful because Big Four consulting firms are very political. They're very good at stiff-arming other third parties out of the picture because they're territorial in that way. But at the end of the day, you're the client. If you want a mix of Big Four consultants and other consulting firms or other independent consultants, you should do that. That's your project. You can do what you want, even if you get pressure from outside parties. The other thing I'd say is if you're going to evaluate Big Four consulting firms either as a client who might want to engage one or as a consultant that might want to go work for one, I'd look very closely at the culture of the organization. There's very different cultures in these different Big Four firms, and they're generally very strong cultures too. And it's not just the culture of the entire organization you want to look at. You want to look at the team that's being proposed to your project or the team you would be working with if you're a consultant at the consulting firm. So the cultural fit is something that's really important. A lot of times that'll be the deciding factor for organizations because, quite frankly, if you look at these Big Four consulting firms, they're pretty comparable in terms of competencies, methodologies, training, caliber of resources, et cetera. You're going to get smart people. You're going to get good methodologies. You're going to get a lot of inexperienced hires as a part of your project. That's sort of a given on all fronts with Big Four consulting firms, but it might come down to culture. You might get a certain feel and a cultural fit that you've got to evaluate that is equally or maybe even more important than some of the other criteria I've talked about so far. So those are just a few things to consider as you're evaluating Big Four consulting firms, either as a potential client or as a potential employee. So I hope this has given you some good guidance on how to make that decision and navigate the world of Big Four consulting firms. If you'd like to learn more about digital transformations and learn more about what I've learned in my experience both as a Big Four consultant and working with Big Four consulting firms, I encourage you to read my new book called The Final Countdown. You can read that by scanning the QR code in front of you, going to the links below, or just go to thefinalcountdown.com. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.